morning, and welcome to this next episode of Governance Dialogues, a program that I have a pleasure to host. My name is Elisa Cole, and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center. And as for the past episode, I'll be a host today. And those of you who have been following our program know that this program is principally tackling governance challenges around the world. And yet, if we think about governance, and even if we reflect on the OECD definition of what is governance, it is ultimately a series of relationships between the shareholders, the stakeholders, management, and the board. And within this word relationships, there's obviously encapsulated or implied, I think, a concept ultimately of relationships between these parties, and leadership of different individuals, whether we're talking about the chairman, the CEO, and others, leadership qualities that ultimately can, so to speak, make or break certain organizations. And with that in mind, I thought in today's episode to explore leadership. And for this purpose, I've invited one of the world's leadership gurus, Dr. Andrew White, who's joining us from London today. Andrew, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm really looking forward to exploring all the topics which you've just outlined.
Yes, likewise. In fact, just for our audience, perhaps I'll say one or two words about your work. You are obviously have been associate dean in Oxford Saïd Business School. You also run a company called Transcend Space, and indeed, I know that you're working to help leaders around the world, whether boards or senior executives, transcend some of the internal strategic governance and leadership challenges around the world, whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world where I know you're active. And we would like to leverage your experience today and sort of delve into some of these more, into the nexus actually between governance and leadership. And with that in mind, perhaps the first question that I'd like to pose to you is more of general nature around the leadership challenges that you see senior executives and board members face today, and maybe a few comments that you could make on some of the more recent stories that, like, for example, the Boeing debacle, which perhaps is interesting to also explore from a leadership perspective.
Thank you. And it's a great question. So I think for me, something changed around the time of 2008, the financial crisis. And most of your listeners of a certain age will recognize that, we shifted from a world where we were living in long periods of stability, punctuated by periods of change. That if you were a company caught up in a disruption, it was a rare event. If you fast forward to today, I think the first big shift that we've seen is pretty much every company, every industry is in some form of disruption or has got that disruption on the near-term horizon. So we're no longer living in a period of stability punctuated by periods of change. I think we're living in a period of continual change. And I think that's going to be the case for certainly the next few decades. Now, if you think about where most leaders have come from, they've grown up performing well within the status quo. They've got to the top because they've been able to execute, and those skills are critical. But in the world that we're in now, you have to deal with massive amounts of uncertainty, unpredictability, and huge amounts of change. If you just think about the oil and gas industry and how that is changing and how that will change over the next few decades. If you think about the food industry and the extent to which it's used ultra processing methods, which are now coming into question, my sense is the entire supply chain and the way in which retail operates is going to change. We're not going to go back to the way things were in the 1920s and 30s, but also I just don't think there's sustainability if you look at obesity rates rising and the costs of that to governments. They're just two examples of industries in massive change. And if you are great at executing the status quo, you're not going to be good at that. So that's the first shift. The second shift, I think, is around people. And essentially, if you think about the 20th century, we lived in what we might call the age of the machine. And a lot of the ways in which companies work, they came out of the Industrial Revolution. They really got on their feet during the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s with the car industry, went into the airline industry, which we're going to come on to with Boeing, Healthcare picked it up, other industries picked it up, and essentially it was about predictability, reliability, hierarchy, and it was the factory, and it worked well. It worked well for us, but it kind of ignored people. And then when you go to trying to do a change project, you put together a project plan, and you try and execute the project plan, and we know they all go wrong because of people. And I think the second big shift is we're seeing almost what we might call the humanization of the organization. And it's a shift from a machine metaphor to it's more like a living organism. And a living organism doesn't think about periods of stability and change. It lives in evolution. So second big shift. And then the third big shift, which I think is kind of pretty well understood, is the whole technology, the digitization, which is taking away barriers between industries, which is shifting, companies up and down in the shareholder leagues and things like that, which companies are valued high and low, and who's in the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500 and things like this. So those three things: disruption is normal. We are shifting from a machine metaphor to a human kind of way of working. We've got this technology which is becoming all pervasive. And I think there's questions around that. I am not a person who thinks that we're going to continue just to see technology everywhere. I do wonder at some point, unless we get it right, that there's going to be a pushback. And you can think, particularly in democracies where you get populist politicians, either from the left or the right, if people feel technology is not going to work for them, I don't think we should assume technology will just continue to be rolled out, particularly with AI and jobs. Now, let me give you an example. I hardly ever go into a bank anymore. I use the app on my phone. It's brilliant. That technology works for me. Now, if technology continues to work like that, I think we're going to see it just continue to be rolled out. But if it doesn't, then question mark on it. So those three levels. I hope that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from and the types of challenges I help leaders address.
Absolutely. And in fact, some of them we've explored, the issue of political change and some of the sort of developments we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine war and how that surprised many boards, took many boards by surprise, and something we've actually delved into this on this program. And also we spoke about in several episodes, governance of technology and big tech. And this is something I've written quite a bit on also with respect to Facebook, Tesla, and a number of other companies. And Tesla, in fact, if I think about it, is also an interesting example. And Elon Musk, very much, as you know, a controversial leader in the sense that his public statements about the public investment fund taking Tesla private had cost him a fine from the Security Exchange Commission, and then some of the governance changes he's made, and I've also written about that on formerly Twitter, have also been quite controversial in the sense that he practically dismantled the board of Twitter. And I wonder what your thoughts are on leaders, kind of prominent corporate leaders of this nature, Elon Musk and many others. How would you assess their leadership capabilities and impact?
So let me start with a positive, and I think there is a strong positive story around Elon Musk. He was way ahead of the incumbent automotive makers on seeing the need for low emission vehicles or zero emission vehicles with what he did. He created a brilliant brand in Tesla. And if you just look at the valuations on that as a business, he has a disruptive way of working, which frankly is needed in some industries. They are, I would say, strategically lazy. If you look at large companies, shareholders are lazy, and boards are lazy, and leaders are lazy. And what do I mean by that? Not that they don't work hard, it's that they don't change things. And if you look at what Elon Musk does, he goes in and disrupts and says it doesn't have to be this way. We could create something different. And large companies are just not good at that. And that's what I mean by lazy. It's a little bit of a provocative statement. Not that they don't work hard, because most of them are working crazy hours. Now, the challenge comes when you're really successful with that and the companies start to play a role in society, and they start to go public, and they start to have the impact on the world that Twitter has. Um, and I think that's when that leadership style doesn't work. So it works starting something, it works scaling it, but when it gets to a certain size and the consequences of that business are no longer localized, they become part of society. That's when it just doesn't work. And I think there's an oil and water kind of mix going on here. And in some ways, what might be best for him to do was to kind of allow Tesla to be run as a mature company and go back and disrupt another industry, which is what he's great at. And, and there's capital that wants to do that. It's private capital. It works in a different way because we need some of his energy. But then we see the problems of it when it becomes a company, as I said, like Twitter, which, has huge challenges around its impact. And again, I don't think the long-term consequence of these companies is fully understood. There is a pattern here. We saw it with smoking, lots of lobbying in the 1950s and 60s that smoking was good. And then it takes science longer to catch up with what the real truth is. And then regulators come in, and regulators tend to take decades. And so I think the cost to society of social media has not been priced in.
No, I agree with that. And in fact,
yeah. So is he a good person? No, he's not the kind of person to do that. There's a recklessness about it, but you need that recklessness when you're disrupting. That's my point. So I can't be black and white about it. I think in certain circumstances, his approach works very well. Society needs that. In other circumstances, it doesn't work well.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because I think there's also a governance element to it. Because if you think of Musk, if he was running a publicly listed company, regulators around the world would normally limit mandates of board members, say that if you want to be a chairman, you need to have an independent chairman. So that process of, let's say, separation from ownership to, as you alluded to, running the company independently would in fact be sort of solved by some corporate governance regulations. But of course, when you take the company private, that no longer applies. And then so we have this, let's say, collusion, for the lack of a better word, between his ownership and his management or board prerogatives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you put it very well.
Andrew, one other question I would like to delve with you. Obviously, also you sitting in London, of course, you've worked with companies and you've accompanied probably leaders in this transition towards the purpose company and the B Corp. And I wonder if you have thoughts as to the legal and governance reform, which is needed to go in hand with this sort of leadership transformation. How does that sort of legal transformation towards a B Corp or a purpose company is accompanied or not by a certain leadership change? What does it take for leaders to say, actually, we want to foster this transformation?
Yeah. So I probably should start by saying I'm not an expert in the legality of these things. My sense is it's harder in the US than it is in Europe. That said, when you look at the practices that people have put in place, people are making huge progress with this journey and really pivoting companies. So that's the first thing I would say. If you look at companies like Unilever, like Natura in Brazil, Patagonia in the US, and also there's capital. Now, I know there's been a pull out of money out of ESG funds in the last year or so, but there's still a lot of capital that is focused that way. A lot of younger people want their capital to be deployed around purpose-driven and values-driven investing. So, do more legal changes need to take place? I'm probably not the person to answer that question. But if I think about where some companies have gone and where some companies are today, there's a lot of headroom for them to move, I think, before they bump into legal challenges. And we have to ask ourselves why this whole question of purpose came about. Why did it become part of the vocabulary of boards and of businesses and of leadership? And I think it was a sense that we were stuck in this factory model, where we were just cranking the handle. We saw it with banks. They forgot why they existed. And particularly when you are a large company, you are trusted by society. If you are a water company or an electricity company or a bank, you play a role in a civilization. And when you forget that and you just execute for more and more profit, then I think that's when we have problems. And when banks don't exist, businesses don't exist, people can't get cars, people can't get houses. So they're not just a business, they are a part of a society and how a society functions. So in a sense, they have to understand that, and they have to realize that, and there's a whole regulatory kind of role to that. Now, if you go back into the old world, but let's take banking, when there were hundreds of banks in the US, you could afford for a few of them to fail. When we had, multiple electricity companies, you could afford for some of them to fail. Others would come in and take over them. When we've kind of done multiple decades of M&A and consolidation, these companies become so big, they're effectively operating parts of a government. And if the electricity company stopped working, or the water company stopped working, or the automotive companies, because they employ so many people, the consequential impact on a society is huge. And that's why the whole question of purpose came about. And then if you look at the impact they're having on the world, it's huge. What I would also say is, and I think this is perhaps lost in some of the current debates, I would not want my pension totally tied up in some of the big oil and gas companies for the next 30 or 40 years, because I don't think they're moving fast enough in terms of climate change and, from my understanding of the science and the weather events we're seeing, and therefore the regulatory shifts. Now, I know it's been pushed out, it's come back a bit. My sense is it's going to be pushed tighter again at some point. And, are those companies ready? And this is not about, doing good for the world. This is just whether they've got a sustainable business model. And I don't think they've recognized that, they're going to become a commodity. And in some ways, oil and gas has been used to very high margins, and renewables have lower margins. The telcos have had to get used to this. If you go back to the telcos 20 years ago, they were, particularly the mobile companies, had big brand premiums on them, on their valuations. They've had to get used to their utilities. I remember telling somebody this 20 years ago, you're a utility. They were really upset. No, we're much more than that. We do this, we do this, we do this. I said, end of the day, you're a utility. And if you look at Vodafone and if you look at some of these other companies, that's how they're valued now. Sorry.
It's just I'd like to rebound on this issue. We actually discussed it in at least one or two episodes in this program, issues around divestment or engagement, and what do funds or what do asset owners or asset managers who manage funds on behalf of pension funds should do in these cases. And I think it's an interesting governance debate as well. But just to go back to the comments you're making about kind of transition towards a purpose at the company level. Of course, in your work, you also accompany business leaders in their transition from what you call, or in one of your retreats, you referred to it from opportunist to an alchemist model. And I wonder if you could share and kind of perhaps explain a little bit more for the purpose of discussion, why you find that model so compelling, and perhaps some interesting examples of these types of transformations of leaders that you've accompanied in your work from kind of more opportunities towards more of an alchemist model, which I think actually goes hand in hand towards this purpose of the corporation debate.
Yeah. So let me just jump back though to the divestment question.
Okay.
I think it's interesting because I've kind of gone through this myself with how I invest my own pension. And, if I own shares in an oil and gas company and then I don't, someone else is going to buy them and collect the dividend. I'm not sure whether that's material. What is material is new capital Or do I invest that money in another business that is, one could say, is part of the future? So it's more the, I don't think the question is it right or wrong to have, certain companies in your portfolio? It's, where are you deploying that capital? What's the opportunity cost of the capital? And could you deploy the capital elsewhere for something that is, you could say more aligned with your values, is better for the world, is more about the future? So for me, that's where that question really bites. To go back to the question of the transition from the opportunist to the alchemist. So the wording that we're both referring to comes from a paper from Turberton or Rook in Harvard Business Review called The 7 Levels of Leadership. And what they found through their assessment process is most leaders who are successful in today's world, this is slightly changing because the data in the paper is probably 10 years out of date, is 10 years old, get to what they call an opportunist. And an opportunist is what a brilliant leader was in the 20th century. Great at executing the status quo, brilliant at sales, profit, revenue growth, but really didn't think about the bigger complexities of what it meant to lead in today's world. And what we find is some of those leaders get badly caught out when things start to change. They're not good at changing, and they're not good at disruption. They're not good at thinking about the impact of the business on the world. And what we are seeing is this shift to what we might call an alchemist. And an alchemist, and I'm going to give you 3 concrete examples, and also let your listeners know where they can go to find out about these. The alchemist really understands what is the role of a business or an organization where it's trying to address a major challenge in the world, and how do you do that and make money at the same time? So my 3 go-to examples of this. Firstly, there's somebody called David Katz. He runs something called the Plastic Bank. I have an interview with him on my podcast called, my podcast is called Leadership 2050. And if you go on there, you'll find the interview I did with David Katz. The Plastic Bank essentially takes money from consumer goods companies. It then uses that money to pay people a living wage in areas where plastic is washing up on beaches. That money goes into hospitals, into schools, into household incomes. The plastic then goes back through the recycling system and becomes plastic for good. And that goes back into the consumer goods companies. So essentially, he's taking something which was problematic and having an alchemical impact, if that makes sense. So the alchemists tried to make pure gold from base metals. And so there is something alchemical in the way he's working. The second example is someone called Odette Excel. She is an investment banker and runs something called the Adara Group. The Adara Group does kind of M&A and investment bank type activities. But what the Adara Group also does is one of the world's leading development organizations in off-grid maternity care. So this is maternity care in parts of the world where there's not road or rail infrastructure or difficult to get airlines in there. Now, her argument is that she sees no moral difference between an investment banker and a nurse. So she's coming from an interesting position. She says, I can go to an investment banker and I can ask for $1 million, and I can do a fundraising and I'll get $1 million. Or they can get them on a deal and they generate $25 million worth of fees. Now, because of the way Adara is structured, that 25 million pays costs and then goes into the development organization. So the investment banker doesn't get paid. What they get is like a receipt or a pay slip that has all the things that their fees have paid for. It's alchemical in the way it's working. It's combining things that people, you would normally have a development organization over here, an investment bank here, and maybe some nice dinners where they kind of came together. But what she's doing is bringing them together and people move between the two. And she's not seeing the duality. She's not seeing the judgment of you're good and you're not good. And it's brilliant the way she's working. And the third person is someone called Jack Sim. Jack runs the World Toilet Organization in Singapore. Him and about 6 employees are responsible for about 1 billion toilets in the world. They've changed the policies of India, China, several other countries. He's an incredible individual. And again, I've got podcasts with all three of them. And they look at the world, they see a problem, they orchestrate a solution. Sometimes it's a normal business. Sometimes with Jack, it's just, I think it's the power of his personality. And they're able to address things. And I find them deeply inspiring. I think the world needs more people like this. They are huge disruptors, but they are doing something I think is more difficult than what Elon Musk did. He took a known product to car and changed the way it was powered. These people are reorganizing whole systems, or they're inspiring at scale, or they're combining things that people didn't think could be combined. And I think that gives us all hope. It gives us all insight into what leadership the world needs that's here today. It's not some theory, and we probably need more of.
Absolutely. And I remember some of these examples, perhaps except for the last one, you also mentioned during your retreat, and I found them actually quite mind-boggling. And some of the industries, they seem quite banal, but it sort of makes me think of, I don't know if you saw, there was a Japanese movie that came out recently about a gentleman who's a toilet cleaner, who goes cleaning toilets in Tokyo. And when you see the preview, you think quite banal, but then you watch this movie and you're sort of blown away by the depth. But it's just a parallel. But there are really fascinating examples of leadership, and I know that you have many more. But just for the interest of time, we might not be able to delve into all of them today. I know that for our audiences, you can of course look up Andrew's work and his publications, including the Leadership 2050 podcast, and some of these companies, including Elon Musk and Facebook and others, I've also been writing about. And of course, any further questions, please feel free to write to us at inquiries@govern.center. And Andrew and I would be, of course, available for any other questions or clarifications that we could provide. Andrew, it was such a pleasure to have you on our conversation today, and I look forward to many more on and offline. In London or the Middle East or wherever we might cross paths.
Thank you, Alyssa. Wonderful to talk, and really inspiring to see your work and to, for our paths to cross in this way. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thank you.